So, Presidents, Ministers, Excellencies, I have a great honor to moderate this first and very, very distinguished panel. I could easily say that they need no introduction, but I will still introduce them. The President of the Republic of Georgia, Salome Zourabichvili, the Defense Minister, Ursula von Leyen, and of course our own President of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid. Let me make a couple of quick remarks and then pass over to our distinguished panel, people who are high-powered politicians, but also well-known intellectuals. So a perfect panel for this opening discussion. I would also like to thank the ICDS team, organizers of the conference, for inviting us. As a former member of the ICDS family, I'm, of course, particularly proud to be here on the scene. The headline of the conference and the opening panel is One Past, Many Futures. You know, there is this wonderful Orwellian remark, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Luckily, we are not living in totalitarian societies. So we have scientists, experts, analysts who control the past, i.e. the real past. But of course, we have many interpretations of what past is. We say that the past determines the future. So although we say one past, many futures, I'm sometimes afraid whether we actually have many futures. Perhaps we have made mistakes already, which have left us only with one future. Take, for instance, Ukraine. Was the war, the Russian war against Ukraine, encouraged by the fact that in 2008 we did not properly confront Russians in Georgia? No doubt. How much can we change the situation now that we have ourselves allowed this type of Russian behavior to become a routine? Or did we totally miss the US anger at European countries for not spending properly on defense, which has now burst into an open anger and conflict? I remember listening to Secretary Gates, both during the Obama administration and during the President Bush administration. And I always thought, how can he be so rude? I mean, talking about this defense spending in such a harsh manner. Estonia was spending 2%, so it wasn't my problem so much. But I thought, what a stern language. But compared to what's happening now, it was, of course, total child's play. So I would ask more generally and with deep concern, what are we doing wrong today that could tomorrow jeopardize our security, break our unity, or weaken NATO? Have we already triggered processes which unavoidably lead to those calamities? And the second point, history is not necessarily a gathering of mistakes, obviously. Take European Union. For a long time, European Union was seen as a leader of developing liberal world order. We were champions of soft power. This was great, and this is great. But the world has changed. Power is now the name of the game. So the question is, can the EU overcome its history? Historically, EU was not meant to be a powerhouse, a global player, a military force. We are determined to change the nature of the European Union regardless of why EU was created and how it started. It is a serious challenge, and I'm sure it's one of the issues which will be touched during this panel. And now, dear friends, without any more remarks from my side, I will go to our distinguished speakers. President Zourabichvili, you, of course, have an enormous experience, both from the French Foreign Service and being in high-power jobs in the Georgian politics, now, of course, being top of the top, the president of Georgia. I would be very interested, because you have seen it from, so to say, from both sides. How do you think Georgian future and European future sort of blend together? Both have their issues, both have their difficulties. Do they fit? What are the challenges? And if you can, and I understand if you cannot, I'm a professional diplomat myself. You have been sitting in the French Foreign Ministry. You have looked at the cables of how the French look at Georgia. And now you are reading Georgian cables of how Georgians look at the French. How does it work? Do you see discrepancy? Do you feel that Western Europe gets you, gets us? So these are my two questions. Please.
Thank you very much. Let me start with paying tribute to Dr. Lennart Meri, because at this conference I think that it's not just by chance that there is such a conference, such an important one. And I think that we have to reflect on the fact that probably we are today missing people like that in European politics, in world politics also. And that maybe explains some of our uncertainties. To come back to the title of this panel, Common Past and Many Futures, I'm going to challenge it right away. Not the common past, because obviously we have many common pasts. Georgia considers itself as completely European in its past, in its values, as an old Christian country. Sometimes it considers itself as the oldest European. Unfortunately, we have a much more recent common past that we remember very well, too well, and that has marked and still marks our today's existence, our behavior sometimes, and which appears to me, at least, coming from the other part of Europe, sometimes as being more entrenched than one would have thought and more difficult to get rid of one day after the other. But that's still the past. And as we look to the future, it might look that we're in the middle of huge uncertainties, and the future might look very bleak. European Union has its own uncertainties, and I'm not going to dwell on that. We all know what it is, and it's not very clear of where that the future lies, what form of future, with whom, up to what point, what enlargement or not enlargement, somebody leaving, somebody coming in, and what will be its relations with the big powers today around this European Union that looks very isolated, with Russia that is trying to divide by force, China which is trying to divide by buying one after the other. So it doesn't look, and sometimes some incomprehension with the main partner and ally, the United States. So it doesn't look very clear what direction is the future of Europe. Now, if we look at Georgia, you're going to tell me what is your... it's even more full of uncertainties, starting with what you mentioned, war, the fact that we have 2 occupied territories, 20% of our territory, and the occupying line is just right outside of our houses, 30 kilometers or more from the capital city. A Russia that doesn't look at all like having changed its attitude or ready to change its attitude. On the contrary, it's moving from aggression to provocation, from provocation to aggression, moving the occupying line, multiplying the military bases, practicing a policy of Russification that is very reminding us from the 19th century, the worst period of the Russification of the Russian Empire. And all of that doesn't look very promising. It's also starting to threaten when we have NATO military exercises on our territory, saying that you don't know what we're going to do. Well, we have already seen what they're able to do sometime. So that is quite uncertain as a future. The environment beyond and besides the Russian neighbor is not very clear either. We are living in a region that is still on the other side, on the other shore of the Black Sea, a Black Sea that itself has now developed some pockets of insecurity and is also sought to become a sea of communication, but that's not yet and could be endangered by this insecurity that Russia is trying to spread there. And we are also very close to other regions of the Middle East that are not very clear as to their future. We have Turkey that is no longer on a clear track and perspective to try to join the European Union, and we don't know what path it will choose, hesitating even to get even closer to Russia. Iran and the division that seems to be the drift between Iran, the United States, and hence all the other partners, and it's also an almost neighbor. So all of that looks very uncertain, and we are still in the process of developing, trying to strengthen our democracy, our economy, our links with European Union, so that is not very clear either. So that would seem very, very bleak, this description. If it were not for one thing, which I think that we all should meditate. For us, it's very clear that if we imagine a world in which we suddenly were to lose the European perspective, the NATO solidarity perspective, if those two forces were to somehow weaken or evaporate, we would be very lonely, very isolated, and without perspective or future. And I think that the same is true of Europe. During this phase when we seem to see some populist movement and some skepticism and some cynicism and some doubts and questions, if the European public opinions were going to stop a little bit and just think what it would be, that there is no European Union, there is no NATO, I think they would start reflecting, and the reflection would be very interesting for everyone, because I think it would be a very gloomy word. So, contrary to the title of your panel, I think that we have no other future. We have one common future that is our only alternative, our only perspective. That is something we are very clear about. We have 85% of our population that firmly believes that and has not changed and will not change because there is no other perspective. So we are what you need most. We are the small enthusiasts outside of your borders, ready to move in.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a quick follow-up. I mean, we are talking here, you know, in large swaths of history, the past, the future. But could you name a couple of things which the rest of the Western community could do this year to support Georgia? Let's cast aside taking Georgia to NATO or to European Union, which seems unlikely this year, but some of the real concrete things which we could do.
Yeah. One thing would be, and that would be immensely important, to immediately accept as a member, Georgia as a member of European cultural space. Because that's what we feel, that we are a very old European culture that deserves to be recognized, to be admitted, to be part of this space. The second thing that would be very important would be to open with all the European countries direct flights, because that's the physical connection. We need to see that physical connection with Europe. We know it, maybe better than the Europeans who see still us as somewhere behind Turkey. Well, we're not behind Turkey, we are just right on the other shore of the Black Sea, not very far, and we need those direct connections with the European countries. And the third thing that is absolutely fundamental, and probably not only for us, that is the Europe of education. We need to educate our young people as Europeans. That's already started. I think that the ones that benefit the most in numbers proportionally of Erasmus. So they are voting with their feet. They too consider that they have no other future. There is not a single Georgian student that goes anywhere else but to Europe or the United States. Nobody goes to Moscow to study, so that's clear.
Thank you very much. And I personally feel greatly ashamed on behalf of the European Union that we haven't managed to provide a clear European perspective for Georgia yet. But I very much.
But the perspective is clear for us.
The perspective is clear for us, certainly for us. Ursula, you are a well-known thinker and leader when it comes to EU defense matters. We have been sitting together around many tables, many different tables, when we have discussed both PESCO, CARD, and other new initiatives. Let me start with a more general question. As I said in my introduction, EU was created as a peace project. You know it very well. Now we are trying to create EU, change EU into a kind of a global force, even with a military dimension, slowly developing military dimension. How do you think, where are we today? Are we doing well? Could we do more? But is there also a risk that we are overreaching and we are changing the nature of the EU, while many citizens, as we have seen in many countries in Europe, are not ready for that? They are looking more for European Union as a gathering of nations. That's my initial question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor and a privilege. It's first of all, if you allow, Madam President, it is touching to listen to your words. Just wanted to say that there is a very strong and enriching military cooperation between our two countries. One small piece of the puzzle of staying in contact, of building something up together between our countries. We are humbled by the engagement of 600 servicemen and servicewomen, Georgian 600 servicemen and servicewomen, with us in Afghanistan, in the northern part of Afghanistan, a resolute support mission. We couldn't do without them. And you were talking about the same values we are sharing. Absolutely. I mean, if you're there, you feel the same roots, the same culture, the enthusiasm, the view on the world, the knowledge why we are there in Afghanistan, that we are defending values that are so dear to our hearts. So I just wanted to say this for the very beginning. And yes, Jüri, the European Union, as you said, started as a peace project. That is true. I mean, more than 70 years ago, after the nightmare, the horror of the Shoah and the World War II, that the destruction and the death Germany has brought over the whole world, this was the one and only way to start again. And there's something which we have never ever forgotten as Germans, that right after the World War, at the moment being, we're just celebrating 70 years of Berlin airlift. We as Germans in Western Germany have never ever forgotten that from the very beginning after World War II, the Allies stretched out their hand to take us back into the circle of democratic countries, gave us a chance to develop back into a democracy. And the second point we've never ever forgotten is, for 40 long years, we have been, as a divided country, the eastern border of NATO territory. And we have not forgotten what it means, but we also have never ever forgotten that we could only survive because we had the help and the protection of our allied friends in NATO. This is one of the reasons why, looking at NATO, Germany now is leading the VJTF, or is taking over responsibility for the VJTF in 2019. This is one of the reasons why we are with you in the Baltic air policing, or in enhanced forward presence in Lithuania, because we have not forgotten what it means if you have your friends and allies standing at your side in crucial situations. Coming back to Europe, Europe has grown. When I was born in Brussels in 1958. There were 6 countries forming the, at that time, different name, European Union. Today, we are 28, 500 million people living in peace in Europe. The largest common market in the world. And when you're talking about asking about being a power, a global power, well, my perception is just these few numbers, as I told you, 500 million, and the largest power, the second largest GDP in the European Union, right after the United States, way before China. Along with that comes also responsibility, because you cannot only harvest the fruits of a strong economic power, which is nice to have. Of course, we've worked hard for it, but it's nice to have. But along with that comes the responsibility to care for your neighborhood, to care for the regions you are dealing with, to be willing to get engaged even if it's not nice and clean and easy and diplomatic, but crisis and conflicts and even wars, to be willing to defend your values. And therefore, by now, I think time has come that the European Union is also willing to bring into the global responsibility this piece, this part of acting, always keeping in mind, and there I would like to refer to Leonard Merry, when he says one past, many futures. I understand what he means, or meant presumably by that. If we say one past, one little piece, I always love to come to Estonia because some of my ancestors came more than 100 years ago from Narva and lived there. And in my childhood, Narva was always present. It took a while till I realized where it is. I had to grow up to understand where Narva is. And if you look at Narva, Narva is striking for the juxtaposition of Western and Russian influence. You have the Orthodox Resurrection Cathedral, and on the other side, the Lutheran Alexander Church, showing how intertwined our past is. So this is one past. We cannot and will not change anything about the past. But what we're going, in what kind of future we are going, and this is, I think, the term many futures, is up to us. We choose the future. We shape the future. And we want a common future. And what kind of common, if we want a common future, what are the ties holding us? I think we have two pillars or two ties that are holding us. These are the common values we defend, and I just wanted to repeat a few ones. It is the representative democracy. It is the freedom. It is free media. It is the human dignity of every single human being, and it is, of course, the rule of law. And in defense, the second pillar is the rules-based order. These are the guiding principles for the future we want to go to together. And therefore, the European Union stepped up over the last 2 years to be able, if necessary, to act. This brings me to a term I do not like very much. That's the term of strategic autonomy. I don't like it because I think it's misleading. But what is the thought behind it? The thought behind it is, if it comes to collective defense, there has always been and there will always be NATO. NATO is collective defense and is Article 5. But for the European Union, there are other fields. For example, if I look to Africa, where I do not see NATO, but I do see the responsibility of the European Union to deal with its neighbor and to be able, if necessary, to act. And for that, we have to prepare ourselves. And that brings me to the defense initiatives you were asking about. We've stepped up during the last 2 years enormously. You know all the acronyms. It's PESCO, it's the CARD process, it's the European Defense Fund. Perhaps later on we can debate it in depth, but these are the pillars of the emerging European Defense Union that has only one goal. That is, if necessary, being able to act, and always embedded in what we call comprehensive security. That is, if military stability or stabilization is needed, always combined with diplomacy and economic development. So these are the unique tools the European Union has, and that's why we've worked the way I've just been describing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, Germany has been a crucial power in developing deterrence, collective defense in the Baltic states. And both your EFP battalion in Lithuania, your air policing in Estonia have been very, very valuable, and we greatly appreciate that. But let me ask you a follow-up question. I agree the strategic autonomy is not a good term, and I think it's often misunderstood. But let me ask you a more general question. The health of transatlantic relationship. I mean, there are countries in the transatlantic relationship which have very colorful leaders. So what's your overall assessment of the health of that relationship?
Well, you might be surprised, but I think it is stronger than ever, and it is healthy. And I'll tell you why. I came into office in 2013, and at that time, I'd say we had a few worries, but not many. And then came the crucial year 2014, and I recall it as if it were yesterday. In February, there was the annexation of Crimea, the begin of the hybrid war in eastern Ukraine. In summer, Daesh, ISIL, was for the first time visible and spread all over Syria and Iraq, was 10 kilometers from Baghdad, had overtaken Mosul. You might remember that. At the same time, we had Ebola in the summer 2014 in Africa. And following that year, we had the destabilization of the African countries with the migration and the following debates we had in our area. So when I recall that time, the state NATO was in, I'm deeply impressed how much NATO stepped up and adapted to the security situation, which shows that NATO is alert and vivid and adaptable. When you're talking about how healthy it is, and the relations of heads of states and government, well, I guess you're of course referring for our dominant debate about investment. Well, NATO and the heads of state and government and us in NATO, we are right. Modernization and adapting NATO means investing in NATO, means investing in our defense budgets. And that was the reason why in Wales in 2014, at that time Obama, we agreed that because all our European armed forces had been reduced since almost 25 years, since reunification, since the Warsaw Pact came down, the wall came down, we had thought it might be more and more calm around us and therefore reduced the defense investment. And at that time, we have decided together that we have a turnaround, that the budgets do not shrink anymore but grow towards 2% within a decade. We came from completely different levels. And I can only talk about my country. We were at the lowest point ever at 1.1%, the lowest point ever, the smallest armed forces ever. We did a strong turnaround. We have increased the budget since then by 40%. So think in your national defense budgets and think about an increase of 40%. Then you might imagine we have at a budget now next year of 45 billion euros. Why haven't we reached 2% so far? Because the lowest point was very, very low. So it is an enormous attempt to move up to the 2%. We are determined to do so. As I said, 40% by now. In the year 2024, we will have reached 1.5%. That will be an increase then of the German defense budget by 80%. Of course, we have many debates about that. But I think it is a sign of a healthy relationship because we are able to openly discuss and debate about these things. As I say, the goals are right. Germany has to do more. Many other countries too have to do more. But there's a second point which is important. And that is, cash is important, but also contributions and capabilities. Germany is the second largest troop contributor to NATO. So this shows two commitment. There are many NATO missions that wouldn't be the way they are if we wouldn't commit ourselves and bring in capabilities. And I have been at the last NATO summit in the group of where the heads and states of governments were debating how to proceed. I must say, of course, the debate started about the 2% question. But I've never been in a NATO meeting with such a strong commitment of our heads and states and government to the common values we defend. Of course, we need the instrument of cash commitments and capabilities, without any question. But this being outspoken about what we stand for, what we have to defend, who our adversaries are, what we are fighting, I've never seen that before in that way. That shows me NATO has understood that we have to defend our democracies and our values, and NATO is adapting, is investing, and therefore I think NATO is as strong as it has never been before. If we wouldn't have NATO today, we should invent it immediately.
Indeed. Thank you very much. President Kaljulaid, you have traveled extensively during the last 2 years promoting Estonian bid for the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. But let me approach it from the different angle. You are also representing EU in those meetings with foreign leaders, obviously not when it comes to UN issues, but in general. EU has always been a leader in soft power. Do you believe that for other countries we have still maintained credibility when it comes to democracy, human rights? Basically, what is the situation with democracy and human rights inside the European Union? Is there credibility from our side? And perhaps the second question, are people interested about that? Do they even want to see us as a guiding light? Or has the world changed so much that, quite honestly, nobody cares anymore?
Well, maybe if I start from the second part of the question, let's first look what our own people in Europe do. Are they interested? And to the astonishment of many, probably, the Eurobarometer last one states that the support for the European Union is at a 25-year high. But at the same time, we now have a new analysis which says that the amount of people who worry about whether we will one day have our union is also on the rise. And probably this is a good thing because people are standing up ready to defend what we have. I don't think people will be, free democratic nations will be happy to simply worry at home. I think they will stand up and make sure that our union will continue to prosper. What comes to these discussions about Europe and soft power and its ability to project it, it's very interesting that you ask this question because I can tell you a little story about this which comes from the totally different end of the world, from CARICOM countries. CARICOM countries, as you know, have had a long and difficult debate with European Union about the issue of being tax-free havens and about the issues of security of the banking and money laundering, etc. And it's come to the blacklists. And these countries have not been, of course, happy with these discussions and how they have been, finally concluded, neither. But what they have been least happy has been the way Europe has projected itself to them. And it comes in the format of, I need to call the common number of Commission. So we ourselves as politicians, we are very sensitive to how this soft power gets projected or does it get projected. But we have to reconnect our institutions and these people who have been, shielded from the world 20, 25, 30 years and reached director posts in these organizations. We have to make them as well always to keep in mind that we are indeed, what we are doing is projecting our soft power. And I've sensed a certain disappointment with how the machinery works towards outside. Maybe it's a valuable reflection also. It maybe seems clearer from CARICOM perspective, but probably how the machinery is working is also a problem inside the European Union, as we very well know. But on the other hand, soft power, yes, I think Europe has soft power, but I disagree, it only has soft power. Yes, European Union was created for security as a common good. When we arrived at the scene and joined European Union, I think it was much more prosperity as a common good than security as a common good in 2004. But we have now returned to the basics, security as a common good. But definition of security and what needs to be done to achieve security has radically changed and shifted. When European Union was created, then security as a common good had to be guaranteed first and foremost within the European Union. Now, we do not have discussion anymore. This is totally gone away. But security as a common good now means that we need to work globally. And hence I find that in the very first and foremost reason of creating the European Union, looking that, I mean, lots of time has passed, and looking how the world has changed, how Europe has changed, in this sense, nothing has changed. Europe has to develop itself so that it can provide security as a common good. If it now takes PESCO, if it now takes looking outside, if it now takes protecting our external borders, if it now takes working closely with countries quite far of us, then this is still working towards our original objective, security as a common good. It didn't matter maybe when we were more thinking in the categories of prosperity as a common good, because neither security nor prosperity can be provided without our underlying values. I mean, you would fail on both counts anyway. So European Union is founded on our common value principle, and this makes us actually responsible also for enlarging this kind of, universe of good. But not even thinking in these terms about, for example, Georgia, I would say that if we want to have more security as a common good, we should actually at least involve Georgia in the discussions about EU enlargement, and do so quite quickly. Yes, I do think that Georgia is maybe not yet the country which could pass all the Copenhagen criteria, which are the difficult topics or the first chapters of these negotiations when we start joining European Union. It would take longer than 30 minutes, and it should be down to 30 minutes before maybe you start these discussions. But on the other hand, it would greatly enhance security as a common good for the whole Europe if we said we are discussing enlargement not only in the Balkans, but also among Eastern partners. And why I think it would make us all safer as one act is that it's quite common thinking that if you are partially occupied by Russia, then your door is closed, cannot join European Union. And if I now draw the parallel from 2008 to 2014, we all know that there was an element of Crimea happening because after Georgia, our reaction was, don't worry, business as usual. And then Crimea happened.
Moldova.
Exactly. And now, if you think this way, then with saying, no, Georgia cannot be involved, and quite many people, and there are also politicians in Europe who say that, come on, how can you think of it? They're partially occupied, blaming the victim. Means that this signal is clear. If you don't want somebody to get closer to European Union, partially occupy them. I don't think we want this message to be out there for our Eastern partners. And I think also, if we want Ukraine to have more incentive to fight with corruption and become more similar to us, well, at least, I mean, waving a hand towards Georgia, I'm not saying we should give clear perspective. Jüri hopes we could one day, and I hope one day we could. But at least accepting that, I mean, besides the discussion about Balkan enlargement, there could also be a discussion of Eastern Partnership enlargement. And I think this would be for security, not only because Georgia wants to be an EU member, is a country which shares our values and deeply wants to join the European Union. I think with these kind of steps we can also, I mean, projecting soft power at the same time rising the real hard security for all of ourselves. This is important.
Thank you very much. Can I make a follow-up question, which is perhaps a bit provocative? You mentioned at the beginning that we should be able to reconnect with the outside world. You mentioned that some countries are asking what is the telephone number of the Commission. Do you believe that there are fundamental issues in this Commission or the structure of officials at the EU which should be changed? For instance, I'm always surprised that people wouldn't call for, reduction of the Commission or stuff like that to make it kind of more flexible, something of that nature. Do you feel that there are some fundamental flaws when it comes to Brussels?
I'm between the rock and the hard place, because you know very well that, I could analyze for hours what exactly could be better for our European Union. But all this negative noise about our European Union has made our space to discuss the technical problems and issues without putting into the question our European Union. This space is extremely narrow, so it's very easy to risk a headline that, well, you know which kind of headline. Anyway, I do think that Europe, and I wouldn't start with the number of officials, and I deeply think that the career model of European institutions, I mean, comes from middle of the last century, and we should have much more flexibility and freedom in the labor market, also in the institutions, similarly to Hartz IV reforms carried out in Germany. European institutions have not seen such a reform, and it's long overdue. But this is beside the point. The point is European Union should concentrate on the areas and subject matters where it can provide for either security or prosperity for the common good. And right now what we are doing, we are dispersing our resources in Europe on a wide array of things, where sometimes also stepping over the subsidiarity principle. Solidarity is very important, but my favorite principle in treaty is subsidiarity. And I very often see how Commission gets tangled in the matters which are best solved at the local government level. We all know these examples, I mean, in consumer protection, etc., where you should simply set policy, but not monetize the policy or try to run any elements of this policy from the European Commission. But then, of course, that would mean that you'd probably have less function or at least no budget for many commissioners who would then be only policy setters and not budgeted to, I mean, monetize these policies, for example. But overall, I think there is nothing materially wrong with institutional structure, but also how we use it. Take, for example, the matter of democracy and the right-wing extremism. When it first appeared to be a problem in Austria, we were not part of the club then, but then the council took responsibility for it. And council was able to talk with their counterparts in a respectful way until the problem, obviously, for, well, years to come was solved. Now, when the same things started to happen in Hungary, then the council comfortably downloaded dealing with this problem to Commission. And it happened to be Barroso II, which was first commission according to Lisbon Treaty, which is a body of permanent secretaries according to Lisbon Treaty, so absolutely not equipped. And we see the result. There is no result. There is Frans Timmermans still fighting, tackling, getting into really nasty spats over this issue. Because council, the body of elected leaders, failed to take strategic leadership. Taking strategic leadership in council is extremely important, not downloading this responsibility to Commission, which is comfortable but will always fail.
But isn't that also a reason that, like the topic of security we've been talking about initially, that we never thought we will have to step up with NATO again, in the same box fits that we have never thought that we would have to defend democracy inside. So, and this is the new challenge. Therefore, the instruments and the procedures are not fit at the moment being for defending the democracy from the inside. And therefore, I want to pick up at the point of the soft power you were talking about to extend it to other regions. We all know that the rise of Eurosceptic, nationalistic, and populist parties has gone through mainly, it has mainly been internet-based. Therefore, the cyber sphere plays an enormous role. In cyber, nothing is inside or outside. It's one. And therefore, I think we have to be way more strategic if we want to defend and spread the values of an open-minded democracy. And you all know these values. We shouldn't differentiate between inside our own democracies or outside where we want ties to, for example, countries like yours. Therefore, the new challenge that we generally see as a threat, the misinformation and the strategic communication and the propaganda within the internet, is also an opportunity to use the cyberspace to stand up for our democracies, stand up for common values, defend these values in principles. You can talk about free media, you can talk about the human dignity, you can talk about rule of law. And there is no reason why we should differentiate between inside the European Union or outside the European Union. In other words, the internet-based communication gives us a completely new room to talk about the basic thing. That's in what kind of state or what kind of governance do we want to live in the hopefully common future, Leonard Berry, we are talking about. So I think this is worth to discuss it.
Yes, this is true, and I fully agree. But I think how we should do is we should go and encourage civil society to take this responsibility. And I may be more in a hot seat about this than you are right now, because right now in Estonia, well, people from various backgrounds write to me and ask, what could I do for you and Estonian democracy? And my answer is always, don't ask me to do what you think is best.
Speak up.
Stand up, speak up. I mean, do something, but do not look for coordination from the state side. That would be materially wrong. It's the civil society which has to defend itself. So I think, indeed, we need to give the tools our civil society needs. Among all, Erasmus, I think. I mean, Erasmus has created a huge network of young people who deeply believe into the European ideas. And I think this is a huge force. If this force feels under pressure, they are ready to come out. So I think we should encourage these kind of civil society movements. But what I would dearly want to avoid is that the Commission takes any initiative.
No, I'm not talking about Commission, but concerning the Commission, I was talking about, I don't think that because you said the Council should not drop the topic on the Commission. What I was defending is that the European Union as a structure is as unprepared to these developments as we are as a society, as a civil society, as politicians in the nation states or in the European Union. So we shouldn't blame the European Union for something. We have a problem ourselves too. But as I said, there is a huge opportunity. It is the civil society that has to step up, but us as politicians, of course, we do have a certain responsibility too to stand up and to speak up. And therefore, I think this is a field where we can shape our common future.
Excellent.
But if I may add a nuance, it gives,
no chance
it
let's
gives
then give the chance to the
an impression
audience.
as if Hungarian problem is of similar origin than, okay, let's say today's Estonian or Austrian or Finnish problem, but it hasn't. I mean, it's a single-party regime, so I think that the peer pressure from a high level of other leaders would have actually helped in the initial stages. But I'm sorry, Jüri, over to you.
No.
You can take over again.
Perhaps we would go to the audience. I'm sure there are members of the European Commission in the room, but everybody is welcome to ask a question. Let's go here.
To me or James?
Let's go to you.
Okay.
State your name, affiliation.
Yes,
Konstantin, many people know you, but
yeah, well,
not everybody.
I'm Konstantin Eggert. I have a strange trajectory. I was born in Moscow, I live in Vilnius, and I work for Deutsche Welle. And my question is to Minister von der Leyen. I was very much heartened by your assessment of a robust state of transatlantic relations until I saw an interview that the Federal Chancellor gave 2 days ago to the Deutsche Zeitung, in which she said that Europe should reposition itself to stand up to China, Russia, and the United States. So where is the truth here? Because it seems that Frau Merkel thinks that America is more of a problem than of a transatlantic partner, if you judge by this interview. Could you elaborate on that? Thank you very much.
Yes, I think this was in the context of trade and tolls, and there is
not
an
only,
issue.
definitely, if we look at the text.
There is an issue. It was certainly not related to defense. So I've seen the quote too, if I may say that. Talking about commerce, talking about tolls, and talking about trade, we do have issues, and this is okay to have issues. So this doesn't do any harm to the guiding principle we do have in defense matters, that we debate about the tools we use in defense, the way NATO is adapting and moving forward, without any question. But concerning the challenges we have, I think it's true we should not only discuss today our challenges with Russia. I think it's also important to discuss the challenges we do have with China, because this is a question that addresses NATO, but this is also a question that addresses the European Union. I think that because Russia is military-wise so noisy, we tend to focus all the time on Russia. China is the most challenging country for us at the moment being. It comes along very silently. You mentioned it already. It comes along by buying itself into infrastructure that is critical, therefore placing global bases all over the place, and doing that by giving credit to poor countries, then having them raising the amount of debts. That brings along dependency. We don't know it at the moment being how deep this dependency goes, but we can be sure that the power projecting that is following that will be critical and crucial to us. So, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative has certainly a vast economic and trade impact, but it also has an enormous security impact, which we shouldn't forget. And I think these are topics we have to debate. So the spectrum is broad. It's not only focused, coming back to your question, to the topic of defense, it's also broad on the economic side, but there we shouldn't forget the ones who are moving forward very silently, and therefore those who are easily then overseen.
Thank you. Lady in the back, please.
Kim Dozier, I'm an analyst for CNN. I wanted to ask if you thought that the American president was helping the populists right ahead of the EU election by embracing Viktor Orban and others of his ilk. And also, what is the responsibility of governments like Estonia's, which raised a populist party's profile by including ECRI, some of whom just apparently flashed a white power sign in a public event?
And the question goes to President of Estonia.
Which is unfair because the moderator is the minister in Estonian government and we are parliamentary republic here. But I'll do it. Neither Jüri nor me obviously shares the views of ECRE, and also we think that having Marine Le Pen in Estonia and it demonstrates that this party clearly does not share our common understanding that Russia is a threat, because we all know what Marine Le Pen thinks. So being deeply nationalistic doesn't mean that you cannot be at the same time more Russian-minded than anybody else in Estonia has ever been. On the other hand, and you also joined the question of meeting of President Trump with Viktor Orban. I think this meeting was long time, in the pipeline, and it just happened now before the European parliamentary elections. I didn't pay any attention to it, neither do I think that the European electorate does pay any attention to it. But what we do have as a worry is that we should really be discussing, what we can do with our European project. Can we finally make our banking union complete? How can we better protect our external borders, etc.? But our discussion level is down to this, quelling this loud noise that Europe is bad, which has taken away critical debate, which we actually need, which concerns, concentration of, for example, European resources on certain strategic key issues, be it PESCO, be it research and development, be it also still economic cohesion. All these things we are neglecting in this campaign, and this is bad in itself. On the other hand, if people feel in many countries for very various reasons that European Union has been a common good project, but the goods have gone to somebody else, and their level of being disappointed reaches the level that they are ready to, basically blow up the whole thing, hoping that in this revolutionary situation, they would be able to get a longer or better position or a better redistribution of the resources in the society. We need to listen. Here in Estonia, we have caught up 25 years of our 50-year economic growth lag compared to Finland in 30 years. And we know that quick productivity rises means that extremely strong side effects in the society. Western European countries have had time much longer to adapt to industrialization, concentration of people in the big cities, because you cannot, rise productivity when you are in rural areas and dispersed. We Estonians have faced this in a much harsher way. So the side effects are, I would say predictably, but from the hindsight, obviously predictably, also very harsh. And now we need to deal with this problem, that we have a group of people who feel that, European Union may have been a good thing, but all the good development has passed me by. And the proper thing is not to call them populists. I never say, therefore, that any of these people are populists. The proper thing and the sign of strategic leadership is to accept that we have not been able to alleviate, be the reasons objective or subjective or neglect for whichever reason. These effects are there, we have not been able to deal with them properly, and to promise that we will now deal with them properly. Not to say that, some people don't understand, just the big picture. And so I'm readily ready to accept that we have a lot of work to do in Estonia, that those who feel that they have got nothing will feel that they now get something. But this is an example of one country which is very common for all of us. European Union and its popularity will always be held hostage to the good governance of member states' governments, because European Union itself does not do any redistribution in the wide sense of the word, education, healthcare, etc.
And I think there's a second point I can underline every single word you said. Just wanted to add one point that is important. Those of us who do believe in the European Union and in our democracies, and that the construct and the future together is right, I think we should be more self-confident, because, and we should state clearly 2 to 3 things. The first one is the populist and nationalist parties come along with answers from the past for the complex problems of the future. And if you want a very simple example for that, and people have understood that already, look at the Brexit referendum. It was triggered mainly by promises that turned out to be simple lies of the populists, how much better the world would be for the British people the moment they left the European Union. You all know the term of 350 million pounds will we save when we leave the European Union per week, and put it in our health system in Great Britain. It didn't even take 24 hours after the Brexit referendum that they stood up and said, well, this wasn't really the truth, this wasn't really meant, we were mistaken by the numbers. So dismantled the lies of the whole campaign they had. The second point, as different as these populist parties might be it Le Pen, Le Front National, the Freiheitspartei in the Netherlands, the AfD in Germany, be it the Greek Dawn in Greece, or other populists, right-wing parties, Cinque Stelle, Lega Nord, as different as they are, we should emphasize they have one thing in common. They want to destruct and divide Europe. And that's something which people have understood now, and where we stand up against, for sure. Because if there's one thing that the populist parties by now understand too, is that the moment they are in power or they are successful, for example, with the Brexit referendum, people see what the effects of their influence are. Look at the populist parties all over Europe. Silently, they took out of their party program that they want to exit the European Union because they've understood that people are getting smart now about the follow-up and the effects of populist policies. So, recommendation to ourselves, self-confidence, step up for this European Union, and we shouldn't be too shy towards the lies that are presented to us, but name it and blame it and show it to the public.
Precisely, this is my biggest, puzzle for myself. Personally, I find it very hard to lie, particularly if I know that somebody will find it out in 2 minutes. They don't. I don't get it.
Okay. So I think there was, James, did you have a question?
My question was asked in different words than I would have chosen, but it was asked.
Perfect. Ed.
Edward Lucas from SEPA. It seems to me that you're talking about playing a defensive game here, which is fine, because we're being attacked. But I'm very glad, Minister, you mentioned China, because they do have a strategic vision of the future as an infrastructure superpower, cultural superpower, cyber superpower, increasingly military as well. And I worry that we're not really getting to grips with that. And I'd like to ask you to go into a bit more depth about how you see our relationship. Are we trying to constrain China? Are we trying to confront China? Will we see German ships in the Pacific going through the Taiwan Straits like the French did just a few weeks ago, causing the typical Chinese reaction? I'd like to ask you, Minister, what about Georgia? Do you see China as an insurance policy, building a big deep water port under Chinese ownership? Is that a way of balancing Russian interests in the region, or is it the same weaknesses being exploited by two different people? And President Kaljulaid, why does Estonia go to the 16+1? What should Estonia really be doing? Maybe it's time for Estonia to invite the Dalai Lama here, or to do something, do something dramatic. But we see, we see a real absence of collective action and leadership in European dealings with China, and if we don't address it, China will exploit it.
Perhaps, Madam President, on Chinese influence in Georgia.
Chinese influence is there. I mentioned it at the beginning.
Yes.
It's there as it's everywhere. And we're seeing it in infrastructure, in some of the tenders. China is coming forward more than sometimes the Europeans or our Western partners. So there is no much choice, but I think there is a realization that it's something that we have to tackle with caution. We have had in the past of Georgia a long history of balancing different empires and powers. I'm not sure that we are in that situation today, because we are confronted with an immediate power empire that is at our doors and on our territory. So the time is not yet for this type of subtle play. The time is for being and trying to get insecurity and defense. And there I agree with what was said before. I think it's one of the fields in which Georgia should be accommodated to be much closer with the European Union and NATO. It's a field in which we are present in the outside missions, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Central Africa. And by the way, I would be a bit less optimist on Africa and what's happening there, because it's not only China, it's also Russia that is progressing very much in African territory, and I don't think that we are paying much attention to what's happening there. So I think that we are very ready to be whatever the form. And I think that in general, the question of in or out, enlargement or not, is a real question, and that's the ultimate question. But meanwhile, I think we should find more flexible forms of observership, association with different programs, and especially in the field of security and defense, if we want to have the most of all and allow for more solidarity at a time when, I agree with you, the threats are growing and they're not limited geographically anymore, any longer. So if you have a Brexit, we could have geo-enter, whatever is the word, in different sectorially and starting with the main fields in which one is ready. And one of those is association to security and defense.
Thank you.
The complex situation with China is one of the strongest arguments if you want to convince somebody why it is better to move forward as one European Union compared to one nation state. Because no European country would be as foolish as to think it might be able to act on its own. So the European Union, what I think we have to do is think way more strategically about China. We haven't really set up a European China strategy. We have many thoughts about China. It's the opportunities and the challenges we see in our different nation states, the different countries within the European Union. But so far, I do not see any kind of consolidated China strategy. And when I talk about China strategy, I think be, first of all, aware of, yes, there are positive sides, but also be aware of the downsides and then discuss how you want to deal with them. One thing is for sure, it also shows us how important it is over and over and over to stay in a close contact with our American friends. Even if there are these issues about trade and tolls and export and import, if you draw the line underneath opportunities and challenges, and if you look at the basic concept in China that is pursued, I'm only, for example, putting in the discussion the word social scoring. And if we ask about what kind of society do we want to live in, it is crystal clear who belongs together, Americans and Europeans, to think about a smart strategy. This is not an easy go, and therefore the more urgent is the need to sit down and sort out this complex topic. I said initially at the very beginning that China is coming along very silently. I think this is the reason why we see bits and pieces here of problems, but we do not really have an approach, an overall approach that is consolidated and cohesive. And therefore, it's high time to be aware that we are always focusing, this is right, on Russia, because Russia is so noisy, and militarily provocative, but don't be fooled about China's progression, if I may put it that way.
First of all, we have noticed that there are countries globally who have been crippled by their debt for China. There are countries globally who have crippled their economic development by giving big sectors away to Chinese capital and actually limiting their own homegrown debt to SME sector, and there also to very low limits. But if you look at Europe, can anything like this happen in the European Union? That's my question. And I would say that economically, we are protected by our public procurement and competition rules. Chinese capital cannot do so much harm in any European country because Chinese capital in European investment would still have to apply European public procurement and competition rules. In many sectors, we demand the openness for the third parties. Think of the new gas directive, for example. We think of it mostly in the context of Russia, but we have generally this rule in Europe that you cannot cripple by any single deal, by any single investment, by any will of any government to sign such deals, economy. And we are very well protected by the European legislation from this happening to the European countries, which of course doesn't mean that we don't need a China strategy. We very much need a China strategy because, you know, the same very good and protective European competition law will come back as a boomerang and hit ourselves by the head in next couple of years, because we do not have, for example, a common Huawei strategy in Europe, which means that everybody will find their own solutions whether to have or not to have Huawei present, and this will cause a high number of competition debates and court cases in the whole Europe because we lack this common strategy. So I absolutely think that we should indeed have a common position, common strategy, but I don't think that this strategy would mean we absolutely do not, trade or invest in China or vice versa. I don't think this would be a wise way as well. But where you are, again, completely right is that if you look where are the strategic security risks for the United States, then they are in Asia. They are not in Europe. So let's pay attention that they stick with us, not for security, but only because of the shared values as well. Yes, we form a common bloc, but their risk profile would say that they should actually be less visible in Europe and much more active there in China. And we should therefore also take on NATO the burden of being also ready for China. For example, if you think of the next generations of weapons, which involve much more new technologies developed by private companies in free world, like Free Mind, for example, AI technologies, but still developed under the control of government in China. We have a handicap here. We like this handicap that not everything interesting happens in public sector and under government control. But China, in this case, if you think of the new weapon systems, has a strategic advantage which we should consciously overcome.
Thank you. Taavi, did you have a question? The last question. The last question goes to Taavi Rõivas.
Thank you very much, Taavi Rõivas. I'm an Estonian. And 6 years ago, Ursula and I were colleagues at her previous job.
Yeah.
First of all, what was asked by the representative of CNN, I think, I can be much more free than perhaps... I admire how you answered the question, that I would have answered it the same way, but as I'm a free citizen, I can just say that it was a grave mistake to allow EKRE to the coalition, because it's not their fault that they are like they are. We know that they are this way, but I think anyone who voted for them being in the coalition or in the government made a grave mistake, and we are all, of course, suffering from that. I enjoyed very much what you commented on this particular topic, and as I said, I would have probably said it the same way. But my question is actually on a different matter. Minister von der Leyen, you said that China might be even a bigger threat than Russia, and allow me to say that.
I said it's different.
Okay, because for me it's a bit difficult to understand. I do understand that China is in a way kind of being a bigger player in economic matters, and that's obviously a concern for Europe. But shouldn't it be this way, that we should think how we can be greater instead of limiting China from investing? I know it's a bit provocative, and I know that there is like different angles to see it, but is actually China even nearly as big a threat as Russia is? Because Russia has actually occupied several European countries and is still in war in Europe. So can we compare those two?
No,
and I know I'm provocative.
This is exactly the point.
Thank you.
This is exactly my point. You cannot say the one threat is bigger than the other. They are different, but they are there. So Russia is, of course, I don't have to tell you. The whole debate about modernizing NATO and adapting NATO for collective defense again, which we never thought we would have to pick up again, has a reason. So we've seen it over the last year, beginning with the annexation of Crimea and the hybrid war in the Ukraine, eastern Ukraine. But of course, we know the daily provocations you have in your country here. I hear it from my officers, from the Baltic Air Policing. On a daily basis, there are the provocations, and we could tell for a long time stories over and over again. What I was saying is that Russia's provocations are very visible and noisy. Russia has one weak spot, and this is its economy. It has an economy that is smaller than, the GDP is smaller than this one of Italy. And it is an economy that lacks modernization, highly dependent on energy export, and a demographic development, a demographic change in the population that will, for sure, impose more social necessity and social expenditure on the country. And this combination needs drastically a modernization of the economy. But if you want to modernize your economy, you have to open up. You have to bring in innovation. You have to bring in new capital. This brings in new ideas, and this brings in opposition. So there is the dilemma. Second point, with Russia, we shouldn't underestimate it. It is expensive to be in the different countries where they are, and to be in the eastern Ukraine, and to be in Syria. So a completely different topic to China that is smooth and silent and different. And it's the Road and Belt Initiative. We have just been discussing about it. It is the spread of power projection in the South China Sea. I've seen over the almost 6 years now I'm in office, the rise and the growing of these islands that were not existing before. Of course, from different other portfolios, you can tell different stories. Yes, we are interested in a good exchange in commerce with China, without any doubt. But what I was asking for is be aware of the downsides and sit down as Europeans and develop a common, comprehensive, overarching China strategy so that we're not being fooled by the smooth approach China has.
I would challenge one thing, that I agree with the fact that one is noisy and the other one is moving in a much more subtle way. What I would disagree with is that Russia's weakness is really not helping very much, because Russia's way to answer to social problems is usually by aggression. Each time there is a high level of social uncertainty or discontent, then there is a new aggression outside, and that has been since Russian Empire up to today the invariable of Russia foreign policy, foreign and internal policy. One thing I would add to that is that what Europe needs, I think, is to become more proactive and see what it can do to do the same thing that the other empires are doing to it, which is to try to divide Europeans between themselves. How does Europe prevent Russia and China of joining forces, of having common strategies? How does Europe prevent China and Russia of trying to court Iran and Turkey? What do they do to prevent a front of being created, which doesn't exist in strategic interest, I think, I hope so. But at least there are signs that at some times and in some questions they might create joint forces. And that is the main challenge for Europe and the United States, is to avoid this front being created that would be then very challenging and very threatening.
Unfortunately, dear friends, we're out of time now, and that's why I also won't make a long-winded conclusion. Let me only say that regardless of gloom and doom going around, I think this panel has been optimistic, constructive, and that's what we like best. So please join me in thanking this distinguished and excellent panel.